Nigeria's credit outlook has been raised to stable by Standard & Poor's global ratings and President Bola Ahmed Tinubu's planned reforms. Well, the week just ending was quite a busy one for the president. We had an address on the economy unveiling the list of ministers with last-minute additions and addressing labor protests and trouble on the external front at Niger. All these, even as World Bank president also came to visit.
Well, now we have the Arise business analyst Bode Ososami, who is here to discuss some of the developments looking at the journey so far for the new administration. Now, first, let's look at the list of ministers. What reactions are you getting from especially the business sector now?
Thank you, Oli J, for having me on the show, and thanks, Andy. On the positive side, if you look at the list of ministers, we see an attempt to balance geographical, gender, age, political, and technical capacity. So there's quite a bit of diversity. But while we wait for assignments, we also see some bright sparks. Some say enough competent hands to assign to very critical ministries. So there are strong hands to steer the ship in the right direction. But on the negative side, some have called the list underwhelming, a terrible choice of cabinet ministers, adding that in most cases, not all, former governors tend to emerge as incompetent, corrupt ministers. Also, there are a few inexperienced hands that can slow things down. So the conclusion has to be that it is a list driven by some merit, laced with the regular political compromises. But what is more useful, Oli J, now is to focus on putting in place tools to get the best out of the choice. What do I mean? In Chile, for example, they designed publicly monitored performance indicators for ministries and agencies. It did help despite challenges in the autocratic political system. So we need agreed and enforced open performance facts, and these performance commitments must be strongly linked to the government's agenda. And as scorecards are used, ministers not seem to be performing can drop out. But even many so-called technocrats may be overwhelmed with the resistance, calling for more softer negotiation and political skills. The other thing is that ministers should also sign updated code of conduct commitments covering unacceptable leverage of influence for personal gain or to reward patrons. Related party interests in contract awards should be covered. Limits to value of gifts should be stipulated. Bribery, diverting resources for personal or party gain, unacceptable behavior should be clarified. Bullying and intimidation, and there should be a pre-agreement to consequences for breaches. The other thing is to mandate from the onset changes to push a new culture of fiscal accountability and reduced cost of governance. If you read the former Minister of Finance, Segun Aganga's book, I'm reading the book, Reclaiming the Jewel of Africa. I think it's essential reading. The former minister, from his experience, says the system we run is not bad, but it's too expensive for our pocket. To give examples, Ghana has cut down discretionary spend by 30%. They've suspended the purchase of foreign vehicles. They've placed a ban on foreign travel, except in critical cases. They've reduced expenditure for meetings, conferences. They've reduced ministers' salaries by 30%. So the tone is clear. In Sweden, according to the book, legislators are expected to use public transport for meetings and travel within the country. And there is regular scrutiny requiring that any excessive expenditure to be refunded. In Nigeria, there is instead a corrosive culture of extravagance. So ministers also are change and reform champions to lead Nigeria to a better future. So they should be trained in change leadership. They know how to navigate bold changes, reach out to very diverse stakeholders. They know how to communicate and carry citizens and stakeholders along. So like someone said, we have to make the best out of what we have. And for us now, what we have to do is watch and see what this group will be able to do.
Yeah, but glad to see you quite a while. By the way, you've touched on the economy in a way, talking about spending 48 total list of ministers in relation to cutting down on costs. What do you make of the number?
it's difficult to comment until you've seen how they have divided and allocated the ministers. We haven't seen that yet. The number definitely looks high if you just take a cursory examination and compare with previous ministers. But let's wait for the appointments. Let's see how the groups. I understand there is going to be some rejuggling or re-engineering of the functions and what they do. And it'll be better to understand that first. It's possible they've tried to flatten the structure so that you have more people having easier access to the top. Some say that makes things more efficient, but if that results in higher costs, then what you need to do is to find other ways of reducing costs. And I've listed examples of what they did in Ghana to bring down the cost. So clearly, by the time we get the full picture, it's absolutely important to get the tone that the government understands that costs have to come down, especially to find fiscal space to do more for the poor, which of course we know is the burning platform in Nigeria.
Also earlier, Bode, that's in the week, the president made a speech that touched on the economy with several interventions. Let's have your thoughts on this. And how can the World Bank support constructively?
Well, first on the World Bank can be a powerful enabler. They can bridge short and long-term funding gaps with cheap liquidity. But the vision, the change leadership, and the stamina to stay the course needs to come from Mr. President. So the World Bank can help you get to where you're going, but you have to clarify, lead, and of course, sponsor your own change. The context is tough after abolishing fuel subsidies and exchange rate reform at the same time. And 4 in 10 Nigerians are said to be living below the national poverty line, lacking education and access to basic infrastructure. So the clear focus of the government should be on this group. Like I said, that is the burning platform of today, the poverty, rising poverty in Nigeria. And the government needs to find ways and means. And that could mean a comprehensive, sustainable, and structural solution to move to eliminate poverty in the country. On the speech and on speeches generally, a biannual State of the Nation address is best practice to keep citizens informed. And the Times called for more than good speech delivery. It was important, of course, to clear misgivings and communicate early stages of initiatives to address obvious pains, even though some of the interventions may still be work in progress. The recent speech, I think, did that to some extent. And Nigerians also want to hear some good news. We heard, for example, you just told us that the credit outlook was yesterday upgraded to stable from negative by S&P Global Ratings on the reforms, implying investors have cause to return. But let me just spend a few minutes just talking about change. For change to succeed, using a simple framework, you need to have demand for change at both the macro, that's the top level, and the micro level at the lower level. And don't assume people want change. Most people understand that they need to be repositioned to benefit from the system and don't really want change. And if they did, their interests are also ready to kill that appetite for change. So you have to make people want change at the top level and at the lower level. And apart from making people want change that benefits them, you also need to supply interventions that make the change happen, also at both the macro and micro levels. So what do I mean by supplying change? Rebuilding institutions, re-engineering processes. That entails complex, comprehensive, multidimensional programs integrating technology, out-of-the-box thinking, involvement of stakeholders. It requires piloting new ideas, reorientation, retooling, and so on. So the bigger job tends to be at the micro level. That is, if I may put it plainly, changing how we regulate companies, how we pay taxes, how we interact with government services, the experiences at government hospitals, the local police station at the airport. These are the things that count. You can't have a welfare system covering 80 million poor or even administer palliatives effectively without very strong technology enablement. So yes, micro and macro level enablement is also complicated by huge cultural and attitudinal issues. So this is a doable journey, but it will not be achieved accidentally nor with feeble efforts, and business as usual will not do the trick. The speech by the president was helpful. in supporting demand for change, selling the rationale for key actions, but sometimes softer. I think it was softer in supplying the critical interventions, which I think requires a more comprehensive approach, maybe requiring more input and more time. But you can't force pills down people's throats just because it worked somewhere else. You also need to pace your agenda for what people can digest and adapt to, so that you're able to get change that people accept, and of course you adapt it to your context. Finally, outcomes count a lot, perhaps much more than effort. So there must be readiness to make corrections as data outcomes reveals the need to correct. Quarterly, monthly monitoring of statistics on poverty in states, on jobs, macroeconomic data, inputs from independent bodies like the World Bank, Ease of Doing Business Group, polling of citizens or whether they feel the improvements or not are all very important. And I must say this before I close, the government must encourage press freedom. They must welcome non-government organizations' scrutiny and criticism, which is often admittedly unfair. But criticism is very important. Critics should never be called whalers. They are often a very useful moral compass. Otherwise, no one will say that the emperor has no clothes, as may need to be said occasionally. Optimism is good, but citizens should also be ready for hard truths. Otherwise, fiction will be fed to people to just appease their nerves. But I think we should give the process more time and definitely give the president a chance to do what he is able to do.
Well, very important point you made there, Bode, about pace the change so you don't ram these things down the throat of people in one swell moment. Just yesterday, Bode, the president flagged off a GIPP, Gwakulada Independent Power Project, to generate average of 10.3 million megawatt hours of electricity per year. How is this going to help? You talked about enabling environment for businesses. How's this going to help generally? Just briefly.
Well, obviously, the electricity is a huge issue. It's a no-brainer that everything needs to be done to fix the huge infrastructure gap there, to get not just these projects initiated, well-funded, well-structured, and it's also a very capital-intensive industry, and many underestimate the capital that is required. And it's not just capital, you also need good project management, good skills, good program management to go from inception to the end. But on ramming issues down the throat of people, and remember that Nigeria has, I don't want to use the word waste 8 years, but we really haven't moved forward. Most of the ideas that were accelerated in the last month or so were raised over 10 years ago and nothing was done. So when you realize the gap that the country has, we have to really catch up. And if you are doing what other countries did 20 years ago, you're not really moving ahead. You are going to the back of the queue. So if you have that in mind, it's important for the government to share this whole agenda, the journey, where we need to go, how we are staging this, so that people can, I would say, cooperate and understand the enormity of the issues at hand, why some things need to be accelerated, why some things need to be slowed down. And remember what I said, not everybody really wants change. Most people want to improve their position, not actually have change. So you really need to sell the need for us to change so many things, attitudes, why corruption is really extremely, limiting to almost anything you're going to able to do. So when you go very hard on some of these things, or you go very quickly, people understand. But there is no need to preach on electricity. Everybody knows that without electricity, nothing can move forward. So definitely, this is one area where you can't do too much too quickly.
All right, then. Thank you so much, Bode, Arise business analyst there.